Welcome to Husband Talking. Explore riveting tales of infidelity with us. Please subscribe and like to stay updated. Let's begin.
My life fell apart in an instant when I caught a glimpse through a half-open door, revealing my wife's darkest secret, another man. Rage consumed me as I confronted her betrayal. The lies, the deceit, it was all too much. His fear was palpable as I sought vengeance. Love twisted into something unrecognizable, leaving me in a nightmare of shattered trust and burning revenge. This is my story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the quest for justice. My wife became my boss today, and soon after, she fired me. Well, she didn't exactly say, "You're fired." She told me that if I didn't agree with her decision about my job, I would be terminated. What she wanted me to do was too embarrassing, so I chose to leave. Grace, my wife for 18 years, and I got married shortly after we started working at Weston Media. This company owns radio and TV stations along with a cable network called Starline Network. Their cable service covered 8 states and planned to expand into 5 more. Grace was just a month younger than me, and though we didn't know each other in school, we attended the same high school. She was about 5'7" and weighed around 115 pounds. Grace had silky blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. She was smart, cute, and had a great smile. At first, I didn't have romantic feelings for her, but the more we worked together, the more I liked her. I am 5'11", 175 pounds, with dark brown hair. I never thought of myself as handsome or ugly, just average. In our last semester of high school, Grace and I interned at WLSR-FM in New York. As interns, we moved from one department to another, learning a lot. Grace liked the sales department the most because she enjoyed scheduling her own day and being out of the office. I loved working in the production department because it let me use my creativity and humor. Even though I was mostly running errands, I learned a lot about the equipment and how to write commercials. It was a fantastic 8 weeks. By the end of the semester, Grace and I were dating. We were both 18 and passionate about radio, but our decision to marry came quickly because Grace got pregnant. First, things were tough. We both had low-paying jobs at WLSR, a 25,000-watt FM station in New York. Grace was an associate salesperson, and I was the overnight weekend DJ. By the way, my name is Ryan Matthews. I didn't like the hours and only mildly enjoyed being a DJ. My job was mostly playing music, giving the time and weather, and reading community events. I worked Friday and Saturday from midnight to 8 a.m. The best part was being able to practice in a production studio, but the job didn't pay enough, so I needed another job. Finding work was hard because the economy was down. I was desperate, especially since Grace was at home with our daughter, Zoe. We were getting help from our parents, and I hated that. Finally, I got a full-time job at a local hardware store owned by a kind couple, Aaron and Linda Peterson. They treated me like a son. Aaron had a woodworking shop in the back and taught me about carpentry, electrical work, and a bit of plumbing, but I still loved radio. WLSR was a top 40 station, so we had a limited playlist, which made my shift boring. Automation wasn't widespread yet, so the station needed DJs 247. But I knew my job wouldn't last long. I read broadcasting magazines and knew that automation was coming, so I worked hard to improve my production and commercial writing skills. My shift ended at 8 a.m., but from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., we used network programs from satellite. During this time, I took meter readings every half hour and practiced my skills. I started by redoing existing commercials, and over time I got better. Eventually, I produced 3 commercials that I thought were good and showed them to the station manager. He loved them, and the sponsors wanted my versions on the air. The station manager didn't offer me a job right away. He told me I could fill in until I proved myself. This was tricky because my commercials replaced those by Nick Roberts, a full-time production employee. Sean and I didn't get along because I had complained about his work a few times. He sometimes recorded over the splice in a tape or used defective cartridges, which were big mistakes. He was fired a week after my commercials replaced his when he accidentally erased an agency commercial. With Sean gone, I got a part-time job in production. Since I was now working 4 hours a day at the radio station, I had to cut back my hours at the hardware store. Aaron and Linda were very understanding, though Aaron seemed a bit disappointed. They didn't have kids, and I think Aaron hoped I would take over the store one day, but radio was my passion. Despite this, I stayed close to Aaron and Linda, inviting them to Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner each year. This relationship would help me out years later. Sorry for getting off track, but you can see how much I love radio. Over 18 years, Grace focused on her sales career, and I worked in production. Deep down, I always wanted to own a radio station. I talked to Grace about it, but she wasn't interested. She said, "Why leave the #1 station in New York for some small station in the middle of nowhere?" So, I kept that dream to myself and continued at Weston Media. That brings us to today. Currently, Grace is the regional sales manager for radio, and I was the regional production supervisor. Grace aimed to become the vice president of radio sales, and I hope to be the vice president of radio production. But 3 men, Daniel Green, Paul Taylor, and Paul Carter, were about to change my life. Daniel Green was the executive vice president of radio, and Paul Taylor was my boss, the current vice president of radio production. Paul Carter came from our sister station in Miami, KJTX-FM, and was made my assistant, though I hadn't asked for one nor did I want one, especially not Eric. Eric annoyed me from the start. He was known as the Golden Boy in Miami, but I found it telling that they quickly sent him to New York. He complained about the East Coast and praised California. I later learned he caused 3 divorces at the station in Miami. Despite my dislike, Eric was a good production man when he tried, but he often shirked smaller accounts, dumping them on others. Since he was the assistant production manager, most people didn't refuse him. But as the production manager, I assigned the work and put a stop to it. Eric was a ladies' man. He was 6'2" with broad shoulders and wavy black hair. Our dress code was casual, but Eric always wore a suit and tie, which he often took off during the day. After Eric arrived, many women started dressing up and wearing more makeup. I had to send out a memo about inappropriate cleavage. My wife always dressed professionally, as did all the salespeople who met with big clients. Grace's outfits were always appropriate. Eric was lazy and blamed others for his mistakes. He spent much of his time flirting with female staff, including my wife. When I complained to Grace, she defended Eric. I dropped the subject but kept an eye on him. One day, I discovered Eric was changing my production schedule, giving his favorites priority. We had time-sensitive commercials, and missing deadlines was unacceptable. After talking to my team, I learned Eric was behind the delays. I complained to my boss and suggested firing Eric, but he refused. Robert explained that Mr. Vallon liked Eric and brought him to New York when Miami wanted to let him go. Mr. Vallon saw Eric as a hardworking young man. I was stuck with Eric, so I had a stern talk with him, thinking it would set him straight, but he continued his behavior behind my back, selectively favoring senior staff, including my wife, likely to spite me. I eventually caught on and was ready to take action. Eric had neglected a spot for a small company that was part of a larger conglomerate that did a lot of business with us. I had to stay late and do the commercials myself. I thought for sure Eric would get fired, but then everything went wrong. Daniel Green, Paul Taylor, and Paul Carter turned my life upside down. But they weren't really to blame. It all started when Robert suddenly died of a heart attack on Saturday night. Everyone was shocked, and the production department was in chaos for half a day. Robert had left a long list of commercials to produce, but no one knew all the details. As his assistant, I stepped in, prepared the details for each sponsor, and got everything back on track. The production department quickly began running smoothly again. After stepping up, I was sure I would get the vice president position. But then Daniel Green announced he was retiring immediately. Robert's death had shaken him, and he wanted to spend more time with his family. In his retirement memo, he nominated Grace to take his place. By Thursday, the executive committee approved her promotion. I was happy for my wife and thought she would do a great job, but then everything changed. That afternoon, I got a message that Grace wanted to see me in her office. I thought she would announce my promotion to vice president, but I was wrong. When I walked into Grace's new office, she and Eric were hugging. They quickly separated when they saw me. He was just congratulating me on my promotion, Grace said quickly. I accepted her explanation and kissed her on the cheek, congratulating her. "Michael, sit down," she pointed to a chair. I sat, expecting to hear about my promotion. Instead, she said, "I'm appointing Paul Carter as the new vice president of radio production." "What the hell?" I screamed, jumping up. "Calm down and sit so we can talk," my wife said in a soothing voice. "Forget that," I spat out. I was angry and suspicious of her relationship with Eric. I worked hard for that job, and Robert told me he would recommend me. "Well, Robert isn't here and I have to do what's best," Grace said, her voice shaking. "Eric is as good at production work as you, and he prioritizes better. Also, I don't want anyone to think you're getting special treatment." "That's bull," I yelled. "How many awards has Eric won?" "None. I've won 4, and your comment about prioritizing is crap. You like him because he's good-looking and always puts your spots at the top." "Michael, lower your voice and sit down," my wife demanded. But I was too furious. I wasn't going to stop, and saying you don't want to play favorites is also crap. I hissed. "Everyone knows Robert was going to recommend me. Now they'll think Eric slept with you to get the job." "How dare you?" Grace yelled, standing up. We glared at each other before she sat back down. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Michael, but my decision stands." I knew arguing was pointless. Once Grace made up her mind, she rarely changed it. Even if she was wrong, she wouldn't admit it. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had gotten too close to Eric. "We can discuss this at home tonight," she said. "No, this isn't over," I said through gritted teeth. "I refuse to work for that guy." "You will if you want to keep your job," Grace said, getting angry. "That settles it then," I said, heading out. "They'll clean out my office." "Look, Michael, I know you're upset, so I'm giving you a few days to calm down. Take some time and think about it. You'll see that I'm right." "Screw you, Grace. I won't change my mind in a few days or ever. I'm leaving you and your boyfriend to do whatever," I said, leaving her office. I think she yelled that Eric wasn't her boyfriend, but I wasn't listening. I went to my office, packed my stuff, and left. The people in the production department were stunned. I didn't say anything to anyone as I left. At home, I poured a stiff rum and Coke and sat in my den, fuming over what my supposedly loving wife had done. As I stared out the window, I realized 2 things: I would never work for Eric, and Grace would never change her decision, especially now that I had challenged her. I still loved my wife deeply, even though I was very angry and unsure about her loyalty. But what I needed now was a new job. I started preparing a resume but only got as far as typing my name and address. I was too upset to continue, so I decided to look through my files of radio stations for sale. Even though Grace had no interest in owning a radio station, I always kept that dream alive. It was like a hobby. I tracked every radio station that came up for sale in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. If a station interested me, I would get all the details. Sometimes I even hired a broadcast engineer to see if the station could be moved closer to a larger market. Nothing ever worked out, but I kept looking. After 4 hours of going through old files and having 2 more rum and cokes, I remembered I had new information on 3 stations that had just come on the market. I pulled those 3 files from my cubby hole. Ideally, I wanted to buy an FM station because most people listen to FM rather than AM. Of the 3 files, 2 were FM stations in Indiana. KRXP in Cleveland seemed perfect. It reached over 1.2 million people. The price was $2.2 million, which wasn't bad considering its revenue. The owner was willing to finance $900,000. I could gather the $800,000 by cashing in my 401k and using our investments, but half of those belonged to Grace. After reviewing our finances, I put the KRXP file in the drawer. WTUV was an FM station in Dayton, Indiana. Dayton had about 67,000 people, but the tower and transmitter were 15 miles east. I had a broadcast engineer check if the tower could be moved closer to Cleveland or raised higher. The answer was no. It could only be done by switching frequencies with 2 other stations, which was costly. That folder also went into the drawer. The last station was WKLM in Miller Springs, Georgia. It was an AM station at 1,420 kilohertz with 1,000 watts of power during the day and 187 watts at night. The tower and transmitter were 10 miles east of Miller Springs. The full power signal barely reached Atlanta's suburbs during the day and was very weak at night. I wouldn't have considered it except for its proximity to Atlanta Savannah. The same engineer reported that the tower could be moved 12 miles southwest. Interestingly, if moved 12 miles southwest, it could broadcast full-time at 1,000 watts. I'm sorry to get into the details, but I was upset and trying to figure out my next move. As I read the report on WKLM again, I heard the front door open and close. Grace was home. I was not looking forward to facing her. Over the years, I learned that Grace was very stubborn when she thought she was right. I'm stubborn too, so our first year of marriage was filled with epic arguments. Our tight finances and a fussy baby pushed our marriage to the edge. Once I even moved out for a week, but I couldn't stay away. I loved Grace and couldn't bear to be without her and our daughter. I learned to let most arguments go unless I had solid proof that she was wrong. In this situation, only time would show Grace she was making a mistake. There was no way I would work for Eric for months or years until she realized her mistake, and even if she did, she probably wouldn't admit it. "Oh, you're in here," Grace said as she stepped into my den. "We need to discuss what happened at work today. Are you going to change your decision and make me vice president of radio production?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I won't do that because I made the right decision," Grace snapped, "and your reaction just confirms how right I was." "Then we have nothing to talk about. Call your boyfriend if you want to discuss something," I said, turning back to the file in my hand. "Stop being a spoiled baby and come to the living room so we can discuss this like adults. And stop calling him my boyfriend. Your outburst at work has already started rumors. Please close the door on your way out," I said, trying to stay calm even though I was furious and hurt. Grace slammed the door as she left my study. The house felt ice cold that night, and I slept in one of the girls' old rooms. My wife was up early and out the door. I knew what was coming. Grace would give me the silent treatment until I gave in, but it wouldn't work this time. I knew the VP job was never going to be mine, and I wasn't going to wait for an apology when she realized her mistake. Over our 18 years of marriage, I had backed off many times. It had been frustrating, but I had learned to live with it. But this issue was too important. I wasn't giving in. So, after a shower and a cup of coffee, I decided to look deeper into WKLM. The asking price for the station was $300,000, which was too high for what they were selling. The income wasn't enough to cover the expenses. 3 years ago, an appraisal valued the land and building at $80,000. I reread the engineer report about moving the station and got interested. I called the broker and received 2 pieces of exciting information. First, Bob Stammer, the station owner, was now in a nursing home, and his wife, Beth, was desperate to sell. She had reduced the price to $150,000. Second, Mr. Stammer had already gotten a construction permit from the FCC to move the tower 12 miles southwest. He had also put a $10,000 deposit on 4 acres of land for the new location. The land cost $48,000, and the deposit was part of the sale. I arranged to meet the broker, Jack Burrows, in 2 days. Before heading south, I needed to take care of my finances. I opened an account in my name only and instructed our broker to sell half of our investment portfolio. Then I transferred half of our checking and savings account into my new account. My new account had $150,000. Grace and I had a joint credit card and corporate cards. I decided not to cancel the joint credit card, as I wouldn't be using it, having ordered a new one with my new account. I would return the corporate card to the station. I doubted Grace would max out the joint card, as it had a $2,000 limit, and she valued her reputation. After finishing in New York, I packed a bag and left a note for Grace, saying I would be away for a few days without telling her where I was going. I knew this would make her mad, but I didn't care. I also told her to say hello to her boyfriend. She would be livid, but again, I didn't care. Finally, I hit the road. The trip took an extra hour due to traffic, but I didn't mind. I was finally following my dream. After checking into my motel room, I drove by WKLM. The building looked like it was held together with chewing gum and duct tape. The tower needed painting, and one of the guy wires was hanging loose. I hadn't decided whether to move the existing tower or buy a new one, but I was leaning toward a new tower. I was tempted to check out the inside of the station, but decided to wait until tomorrow. Instead, I went to see the 4 acres of land. Jack had given me directions, and it was easy to find, with the realtor's sign still up. I called the broker, Sally Wilson, and she was thrilled when I asked her to prepare a sales contract. I explained I would close on the land if I could by WKLM. The next day, Jack showed me around the station. It was as I expected. Most of the equipment was old, and the automation program was outdated. They had 2 tube-type transmitters that were constantly being repaired. However, the main studio console was only 4 or 5 years old and in good shape. The microphones were good too. A walk around the tower convinced me it was a mistake to move it. It had rust and half the guy wires needed replacement. I decided to buy a new freestanding tower along with a new solid-state transmitter for about $48,000. I would take down the old tower and sell it for scrap. After leaving Jack, I told him I would call him tomorrow with my decision. I went into town to talk to locals. Since the station had a religious format, few people admitted to listening. When I asked what format they preferred, the responses were split between talk radio and oldies. The demographics showed a good market for either format. After dinner, I returned to my room to review my finances. My phone beeped, and I saw it was Grace. I was going to let it go to voicemail but decided to tell her that I wasn't coming back to work because I was following my dream of owning a radio station. When I answered, Grace started right away. "Are you over your tantrum yet? So now I'm having a tantrum?" I felt my anger rise. I thought I was being a baby. "I still can't believe you gave my job to your boyfriend," I said, my temper flaring. "God damn it, Michael. Stop calling Eric my boyfriend." Grace snapped, then calmed down. "Look, Michael, I believe I picked the best person for the job, even though it hurt me to do it." I didn't say anything, and an awkward silence followed. "I really think Eric is the better person for the job," Grace continued. "Every time I brought work to your department, it didn't matter to you that my spots were for a big campaign that needed to be done. I had to wait behind smaller sponsors," she said with some venom. "Eric always worked me in and got my commercials done immediately. I believe he's as good as you at production work." "Wow, it's clear how little my wife thinks of me." "That's just great," I said, fighting hard to control my temper. Grace was always full speed ahead when she thought she was right. She must have sensed my anger. "Michael, I don't want to fight. I love you and want you to come home. We need to talk this over and move past it." I wanted to yell at her, but I was afraid I'd say something I couldn't take back. So instead, I decided to be upfront. "Grace, I love you, but what you did at the station was brutal and humiliating. I will never work for Eric." "Michael, I can't cover for you much longer," Grace said sadly. "People are already asking where you are, and Eric is demanding that you come back to work or be fired. He has the right to expect you to do your job. If you don't come back by Thursday, I will have to terminate you." "Do whatever you have to do," I snarled and ended the call. Grace tried to call back, but I let it go to voicemail and then turned off my phone. I was almost ready to go ahead with the deal before talking to Grace. Now I was all in. The next day, I told Jack to offer $85,000 for the station. I was prepared to pay the full price, so I called the real estate broker and asked her to prepare the paperwork for the land. The following day, Beth countered at $90,000, and I accepted. I placed an order for a new tower and transmitter and bought a 5,000 automation program. I met a surveyor at the property to lay out where to build a home that would also house the radio station. I also asked him to locate the tower on the survey. I arranged for a well to be dug and power to be brought to the property. The last thing I did that day was call Aaron Peterson. He and Linda had retired and moved to Naples, less than an hour away. I wanted him to help me build the house. He was thrilled, saying he was bored in retirement. He also said he would handle getting all the permits. With expenses piling up, I knew I would have to tap into my 401k, which was worth about $300,000. This meant I had to travel back to New York to sign the paperwork. I also decided to rent a trailer to live in temporarily on the property. In New York, I would pick up as much of my stuff as I needed for the next few months, especially my CD collection of oldies. I planned to change the station's format to oldies music from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. If that didn't work, I'd switch to talk radio. It was Friday of the following week before I could leave for New York. One reason for the delay was meeting with Aaron. First, we spent a good part of the week inspecting the land, meeting the house designer, visiting the building department, and pricing materials. At the building department, I got a welcome surprise. Bob Stammer had already applied for and received a permit to construct the tower. All I needed was to have Beth transfer the permit to me. I also learned I didn't need a contractor to build the house. I could file for the permit as an owner-builder. I gave Aaron the plans for the tower pad so he could start laying out the forms for the concrete. My meeting with Jack and Beth went smoothly as we signed the sales contract. Jack called Ray Thomas, an FCC attorney, and faxed him the contract. Ray told me the FCC could take 120 days to approve the sale, but it usually took less time. He said if the owner and I agreed, I could start running the station immediately. Mrs. Stammer agreed to let me start in 2 weeks if I explained the changes to the churches and sponsors. We also agreed I could keep any revenue from existing sponsors if I covered the station's expenses. I went to Sally Wilson's office to sign the contract for the land. I spent the rest of the week visiting businesses in Miller Springs and surrounding towns, interspersed with meetings with Aaron and subcontractors. I informed the current sponsors of the program change to oldies. The churches were a little upset but appreciated the heads up. I worked out a deal with 2 churches to allow them to do a morning service on alternate Saturdays. At each business I visited, I explained what I was doing, and many seemed interested. I would have to wait until I took over to see if the interested ones turned into sponsors. Thursday night, I went to bed early to leave for New York at dawn. Avoiding rush hour, I arrived back in New York at about 11 a.m. and went to the house first. I knew I had limited space in Miller Springs, so I only took 4 changes of clothes, 2 twin beds, box springs and frames, my easy chair, a small desk and chair, my tabletop computer, and my 1,500 CDs. I left the rest to avoid giving Grace the impression I was abandoning her. Around 2 p.m., I arrived at WLSR and easily passed through security since I was still technically employed. I went straight to HR and explained my situation. Martha Brown, the HR director, told me she expected my visit after Eric's promotion memo. I asked about any rumors of Grace and Eric, and she admitted hearing them but saw nothing inappropriate. After a few awkward moments, Martha asked if I was resigning. I explained that Grace told me if I didn't return by Thursday, I'd be fired. Since it was Friday, I accepted my termination. I gave her the account numbers for my last paycheck and my new IRA for my 401k transfer. Martha kissed my cheek and told me not to be a stranger. I stopped by the production department to say goodbye and was met with surprise. They asked when I was coming back, and some were shocked when I said I was fired. I didn't tell anyone my plans because I wanted to tell Grace first. Eric stayed in his office, avoiding me. As I was leaving, Grace was waiting in the hall. "Were you going to sneak in and out without seeing me?" she demanded. "No," I said. "I was just heading to your office." "Okay, let's go and put this behind us," Grace said, turning to the elevator. I followed her. Grace's new office had a great view of New York. Once seated, she started. "I'm glad you decided to come back. Eric has ideas for reorganizing the production department and wants to discuss your new duties. I talked to Mr. Vallon and he agreed to a raise for you. You won't make as much as Eric, but you'll keep your old position." I sighed, knowing this would be unpleasant. "It's nice you and Eric plan my future, but I'm not coming back. You said I had to be back by Thursday, or I'd be fired. I took you at your word. I came to give HR my info for my last check, transfer my 401k, and say goodbye." Grace stared at me, unsure if she was angry or sad. "Eric said you'd do this, but it's not what I wanted. Still, maybe it's for the best. I see your ego can't handle your wife being your boss. Getting a job at another station is probably best." "Seriously, you think I'm jealous of your promotion?" I asked, surprised. "I'm very happy for you. I wouldn't want that job. It's too political." "No, I'm not jealous of your promotion. I'm upset you put Eric over me. He's only interested in chasing women. Someday you'll see he's a snake, but I doubt you'll admit it. I hope your decision doesn't come back to bite you." "I don't doubt my decision," she said firmly, "and I don't believe the lies about Eric. So, if you're not coming back, do you have another job?" Remember, you can't work for any other radio station in New York for 6 months. No, I'm not looking for another job, I said, smiling. I've decided to buy a radio station. Grace looked at me in disbelief. I thought we agreed buying a radio station was a bad idea. No, you thought it was a bad idea. I never gave up on owning a station. So, I'm buying WKLM in Miller Springs, Georgia. It's a 1000 watt AM station. You bought a small 1000 watt AM station in the middle of nowhere, Georgia? She asked scornfully. Does the signal at least reach a larger market? Not yet, I said, annoyed by her attitude. It's only 1000 watts during the day, 187 watts at night, but I have a plan to change that. How will this work with our marriage? Grace asked, concerned. You'll be in Georgia, and he'll be here in New York. You could come with me and help rebuild the station, I said, smiling, knowing she wouldn't. I don't believe your ego isn't bruised by my promotion, Grace said, now angry. Eric said you couldn't handle it. I think buying this small station is your way of proving you could have been the boss. I'm done, I said, standing up. I don't care what you believe. I've bought the station and have plans for it. I hoped you'd be happy for me, but I was wrong. As I was about to leave, I added, oh, you should know I've taken half of the money in our checking, savings, and investment accounts. I've also arranged to roll over my 401k to my new IRA. I picked up some furniture and a few things from the house. So, this is it, Grace said, her face turning pale as she stood up. Our marriage is over? I didn't say that or imply it. I was puzzled by how Grace had gone from criticizing my decision to buy a small 1000 watt AM radio station in the middle of nowhere, Georgia, to assuming I wanted a divorce. How are we going to keep our marriage together if you're in Georgia and I'm in Illinois? Lots of couples make it work despite the distance, I explained. I can come up for long weekends and you can visit me. Military couples have it much harder. They're separated for months at a time. That's a stupid plan, Michael, Grace snapped. If you're going to Georgia, then we don't have a marriage. That's up to you, Grace. If you want a divorce, go ahead and file. I'm sure Eric will console you once I'm gone. My goal now is to build my radio station into something special. Grace's face turned from pale to bright red. She was furious. I could always tell when she was over the edge the vein on her forehead would start to throb. Forget you and that stupid station, she shouted. Eric was right about you. You just want to dump me and focus on that loser radio station. If that's what you want, fine, but I expect you to pay half the expenses on the house each month. Grace had pushed the wrong button. I'm not going to fight with you anymore. I've made my decision, and I don't care what you think. If you think we don't have a marriage, go ahead and file for divorce. So, you do want a divorce? Grace was breathing hard, and I could see fear in her eyes. The way you've treated me, I said, unable to stop myself. Maybe that would be for the best. Ever since you became executive vice president, you've disrespected and humiliated me. We talked about our future when our bosses retired. You always said I deserved to be vice president of production. But when you had the chance, you gave the job to Eric. So, forget you. Right now, I don't care what you want to do about our marriage. I'm sure Eric will warm your bed if you get lonely. Grace burst into tears and fled her office. I debated going after her to try and sort things out, but I was too annoyed. I didn't deserve the disrespect she had shown me, and I was tired of always giving in. This time she had pushed too far. The trip back to Miller Springs seemed to take forever, but it was only a little over 6 hours. I kept replaying our argument, and it was clear Grace had painted herself into a corner. I was certain Eric had a big role in my marital problems. Usually, Grace would dig her heels in and wait for me to fold, but with Eric in the picture, I didn't know if she cared anymore. I was sure she hadn't thought about needing to apologize to fix things. Junebe, the divide between us was too wide to bridge. I slept badly that night but got up at dawn, which was good because it kept my mind off my marital problems. The station only had one part-time employee, Amanda Tabor, which was good because that was all I could afford. There were 3 volunteers, but only one, Randy Stamos, offered to stay. Amanda was married with 2 children and needed the extra money. She sometimes had to bring one of her children if her mother or mother-in-law couldn't babysit. I was okay with that as long as they stayed out of the main studio, production room, and transmitter room. When the automation system arrived, I showed Randy how to load the oldies into the program. I sent Amanda out to distribute flyers to businesses and other places to let people know about our new format. I attended town council meetings in Miller Springs and surrounding towns, introducing myself and offering our station's services. I thought my family problems couldn't get worse, but I was wrong. 2 days after my argument with Grace, I got calls from my daughters. Grace, our youngest, called first. She was a hothead like her mother and started right away. "Dad, why have you abandoned Mom?" she snapped. "And why do you want a divorce?" I sighed. "Grace, this is none of your business. I don't want a divorce, and I haven't abandoned your mother." "Bull, Dad," she flared. "Mom says you quit your job because she didn't give you a promotion. Then you told her to go ahead and file for a divorce." "Grace, I'm going to tell you this once, stay out of our marriage." I was annoyed with both Grace and Grace. Even if Grace had spun the story in her favor, Grace was old enough to know better than to get involved in a dispute between her parents. "Mom's right. You're acting like a spoiled child," Grace shot back. "Okay, that's it, Grace. I love you, but until you apologize, we're done. And you can tell your mother the same thing." Then I hung up. About a half hour later, Zoe called. She was more laid back than Grace, but deeply upset that I had apparently abandoned her mother. I was already in a bad mood and wasn't going to put up with more crap from my kids. "Dad, is it true that you're living in Georgia now?" Zoe began. "Yes, I'm living in Georgia," I admitted. But before I could say anything else, Zoe cut me off. "So, it's true you are divorcing Mom." "Zoe, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told Grace. This is none of your business, so stay out of it." Zoe hung up on me. As I sat there looking at my phone, I felt unbelievably lonely. Pissed me off that Eric seemed to have messed with my wife's head and who knows what else. Aside from now being estranged from my family, I suddenly realized I had put all my eggs in one basket. If the radio station didn't succeed, I'd be in a tough spot. Getting a job after leaving WLSR was one thing, but trying to get a job as a failed radio station owner would be much harder. Luckily, I had so much to do that I didn't have time to dwell on it or feel sorry for myself. The transmitter arrived too. Weeks after I took over the station, but I didn't install it. I decided to wait until we moved to the new location. Aaron had already submitted the plans for the new house, and we were waiting for the permit. Meanwhile, I had the land cleared and filled where the house would be. We dug the footer for the house, and the permit was issued 4 days later. For weeks after that, the tower arrived, and the crew came 3 days later to put it up. The new tower could withstand winds up to 140 miles per hour, which cost me another $22,000. On September 1st, I switched the station format to oldies. I took over in the middle of the off-season, perhaps the worst time to start a business in South Georgia. But within an hour, we started getting calls from people thanking us for the new sound. Within the first week, 3 businesses walked in wanting to sponsor us. I was very encouraged. 3 months later, we moved the radio station to its new location. Aaron, 3 part-time workers, and I finished a 4-bedroom, 3-bath house with a partition in the middle. I lived on one side with 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, a kitchen, and a living room. On the other side, the 2 bedrooms were the main studio and a production room. There was a small area by a side door serving as the lobby. A short corridor led to what would have been the family room but was now a conference room break room. I sectioned off part of the garage to create a small room for the new transmitter. To cool it from the Georgia heat, I installed a window air conditioner. I also installed a 24 kW standby generator to power the entire house, radio station, and transmitter. When we switched on the new transmitter broadcasting from our new tower, I was pleased that we covered about a third of Atlanta with a strong signal. Though our signal weakened further west, I was delighted with how much it covered. With our reach into Atlanta, our revenue increased significantly. Before the format change, the station was losing about $4,000 a month. After the change, we broke even in 2 months and turned a profit in 4. Still, I continued investing in equipment upgrades, which drained my 401k. To date, I had withdrawn $160,000 from my retirement fund, paying a 10% penalty to the IRS and capital gains tax. Once profitable, the drain on my retirement fund slowed. Eventually, I started paying back into my SEP IRA. Though the station made money, my income was only about 35% of my salary at WLSR. If I had stayed and accepted the raise, it would have been less than 25%. Despite the reduced pay, I was immensely proud and happy about making the station profitable. However, this happiness was tempered by the fact that Grace wasn't there to share it with me. During this time, I hadn't heard from my wife or daughters. I didn't dwell on my estranged family, as I had more tasks than time each day. Some days I wondered if I'd ever hear from them again. I was tempted to call Grace, but the total disrespect and humiliation would come flooding back, and visions of Eric and my wife made it impossible to make that call. Then one day, I finally heard from my wife. It came in the form of a separation agreement. I was so angry that I signed it immediately and sent it back with a note saying there would be no reconciliation unless she apologized first. I didn't hear from Grace, but my daughters called again, begging me to reconcile. I was polite but firm about wanting an apology from Grace. I also told Grace I expected an apology from her too. She hung up on me. As months passed, I heard nothing from my wife or daughters. I assumed my family had written me off. Then out of the blue, Zoe called. Her voice was so soft that I wasn't sure who it was until I heard Daddy. When I asked her to speak up, she burst into tears. I'm so sorry, Daddy. I'm so sorry. Can you forgive me? Zoe, honey, there is nothing to forgive. I told my sobbing daughter. You were just defending your mother. You couldn't have known how humiliated and disrespected I felt by what she did. Your sister took your mother's side immediately and added more disrespect. So I'm not talking to them until they apologize. That doesn't mean I don't love them. I do, and it's been very lonely without all of you. Thank you, Daddy, Zoe said between sobs. I wish I had listened to your side instead of just believing Mom and Grace. It's okay, honey, I said, trying to calm her. By the way, how are your mother and sister doing? Grace called me a few times, but she only wanted to badmouth you. So I told her to stop calling me if that's all she wanted to do. I've seen her on campus a few times, but we haven't spoken in 3 months. Some of her friends say she's become very withdrawn. I see Mom every couple of weeks when I go home to do laundry. I'm only there for a few hours, but she seems out of sorts. One time when I was home, she went out on a date with a guy named Eric. I don't know if she had a good time because I left before she came back. That news cut deep. Even though I knew I shouldn't let it bother me, it did. Since signing the separation agreement, I had been on a few dates myself. The women were nice, but there was no spark, so nothing developed. Besides, I was busy with work, so dating hadn't been a priority. Do you think you and Mom will ever get back together? Zoe finally asked. That's entirely up to your mom, I said sadly. I won't do anything until I get an apology from her. But let's talk about something else. How are your classes going? I changed majors, Zoe said, her voice excited and upbeat. What did you change to? Communications. Really? Do you know what you want to do when you graduate? I want to pursue a career in broadcasting, Zoe said excitedly. It's a tough field to make a living in, I said cautiously. Are you interested in radio, television, cable, print media, internet? Right now, I'm a volunteer at the college radio station, and it's a lot of fun. I'm also taking television courses, which are great. I have my own radio show. It's a sports show where I do a weekly wrap-up of our college teams and interview athletes. That's fantastic. What do you think about spending time here at the station this summer? I asked. I thought you'd never ask, Zoe laughed. But I can only stay a week or two because I need to make money for next year. I can pay you, I offered. It'll be at least as much as you'd make at a minimum wage job, and you'll get great experience for your courses. Oh God. I'd love that, Zoe said excitedly, then added more quietly, but I have to tell Mom so she doesn't think I'm abandoning her. If she pitches a fit, they'll have to pass and take my old job at the ice cream shop. That's understandable, and I agree. Talking with my daughter really lifted my spirits, and we began calling each other weekly. But 2 weeks later, I got some news that sent me into a mix of excitement and disappointment. A radio station broker called to tell me that 2 FM translators were coming on the market in Atlanta. A translator is a 250-watt FM station that rebroadcasts a licensed station signal to increase coverage. Our signal intersected with both translators, so I put in bids for both. No other station needed the northern translator, so I offered the asking price of $300,000. For the southern one, I bid $70,000, which was $10,000 more than the asking price. But another station offered $85,000 for the southern translator. I was disappointed to lose that bid, but the broker had already told me I had a verbal agreement for the northern one. However, the owners changed their minds after hearing the higher bid for the southern translator and wanted $85,000 for the northern one too. I refused to be hustled and told the broker, "Thanks, but no thanks." I was angry and disappointed when people didn't honor their word. Even though I failed to get either translator, I didn't have time to stay disappointed. I had a lot to do. I was running the station and doing a morning show that mixed in everything with the oldies. After the show, I'd catch up on paperwork and then go out to find more sponsors. Even though I wasn't making as much as I did in New York, I was proud that the station retained 87 of our sponsors once we moved. The station income continued to rise. I was making about 50 of my New York salary, but trades helped a lot. I traded spots for merchandise and services. The car I was driving was leased from a local dealer, and my monthly payments were covered by his commercials on the air. Factoring in trades, I was making about 65 of my New York pay. In June, two great things happened. The first was Zoe showing up, but it was who she brought with her that made my day. She had convinced Grace to come with her. When Grace got out of the car, I came out of the station. She hesitated, but I opened my arms wide. Grace ran to me, crying and apologizing. The girls told me that Grace had encouraged them to join me for the summer. I put both of them to work. I turned over the morning show to the girls, which became a hit. Who knew they could be so funny together? 3 days a week, I took them out to experience soliciting sponsors. They were pretty good at it and convinced 11 businesses to become sponsors. The second great thing that happened that June was the deal for the Southern translator falling through. The FCC determined that the company that outbid me couldn't have the translator because it would give them over 50 of the audience in Savannah, violating FCC rules. I researched the other company that bid on the Southern translator and found they had the same issue in the Atlanta market. They didn't make an offer, so I bid $28,000. The company countered with $48,000, and we settled at $30,000. The following week, I got another call from the broker. The Northern translator hadn't sold, and the owner wondered if I was still interested at the original asking price. I countered with $48,000, explaining I just bought the Southern translator. They accepted the offer. Now I had a high-quality FM signal over all of Atlanta and about half of Savannah. I had inspected the two translators before my first bid. One was in the corner of a law firm's parking lot. The previous owner paid monthly rent and had their own electric meter. Once the deal closed, I negotiated a trade with the firm rent for advertising. I also got permission to put a standby generator next to the transmitter and a 100-gallon propane tank in the ground. The second transmitter was on a condominium roof. I couldn't trade anything for rent, but I learned they had a standby generator for the whole building. I felt good about that. With those two purchases, I moved into the big leagues. The Atlanta-Savannah market was the 17th largest in the country. Even though each translator had a different frequency, people quickly found us. In the next quarterly Arbitron rating, we became the 12th most popular station in Atlanta. With a larger audience, our income jumped substantially. I kept rates the same for sponsors who had been with me from the AM days. Soon, I was making more money than I ever did in New York. Yet I was lonely, but I didn't have time to dwell on it, as it was hurricane season. Georgia had been lucky in recent hurricane seasons, but this year we got hit twice. The first storm hit the East Coast as a Category 3, but was only a Category 1 when it passed our area. I was worried about the house, the tower, and the translators, but everything came through fine. 6 weeks later, another storm, Hurricane Karen, crossed over the Georgia Keys and headed toward us. At first, it was projected to hit south of Savannah, but its path shifted toward Atlanta. A mass exodus from the city began. Roads were clogged with cars heading north, south, and east. I-85 was jammed, and the southbound lane was converted to northbound. Hotels and motels were booked all the way to the Keys. Even the roads going east were packed with cars trying to escape the Category 5 hurricane. A day before landfall, Karen's path shifted north, aiming straight for Naples. I called Aaron and Linda, telling them to come over and hunker down with us at the station. I had built the house well above the building requirements, with extra strapping on the roof trusses, a metal roof, hardy board siding, hurricane-proof windows, and a generator with a 500-gallon propane tank. But with a Category 5 storm, all bets were off. The usual hour's drive from Aaron and Linda's house took 4 hours. About 6 hours after they arrived, the power went out. Winds were blowing at 60 to 70 miles per hour, with gusts to 90. Fortunately, the generator kicked in as expected. Our landline and cell phone still worked, so Zoe and Grace kept in touch with local and county police. Any news we got was broadcast immediately. I was very worried about the storm, but we had prepared as much as we could. We had plenty of food and water. The generator installer had assured me that the 500-gallon tank would last at least a week. When Grace's cell phone rang, it surprised us. We had been using the landline to communicate with law enforcement agencies. Quickly, I realized it was Grace calling her daughter. I figured she was calling to make sure her daughters were safe, but that wasn't why she called. "No, Mom," I heard Grace say. "Turn around and head back to New York. It's too dangerous to try and get here. Please, just turn around because the winds are already over 75 miles per hour. Mom? Mom? Mom! I lost her. She's not trying to come here. Is she?" I asked Grace. "I don't know," Grace said as she tried to call her mother back, but it went to voicemail. Giving up her attempt to reach her, Grace added, "Mom said she couldn't continue on I-85, so she was going to head down the Georgia Turnpike and then cut over using the back roads. I'm sure she'll see how strong the winds are and turn around," Zoe offered with little confidence. The thought that Grace might be driving into the storm added to my worry. Yes, we were estranged, but I still loved her. I could only hope she listened to her daughter and turned around. After another hour, I decided that the girls and I would break into the music more often to offer reassurance, advice, and any information we had to our listeners who were riding out the storm. After a few hours of this, we took turns taking breaks. I was on my second break when I thought I heard something slapping against the house. Thinking it might be a fallen tree, I grabbed my chainsaw and headed out the front door. But it wasn't a fallen tree. I found Grace lying on the front steps. I quickly dropped the saw and pushed into the wind to get to her. She had a 4-inch gash on the right side of her face with blood running down onto her blouse. There were numerous smaller cuts on her face, arms, and legs. The wind was brutal as I lifted her into my arms. She opened one eye, the other swollen shut, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Then that eye closed again. Back inside, Aaron forced the door closed and called for Linda. The girls came running from the studio and gasped at the sight of their mother. I carried her to my bedroom and laid her gently on the bed. Linda was there seconds later with the first aid kit, and I went to get a basin of warm water and soap. The girls stayed with their mother until I shooed them out so we could treat her wounds. As I washed her face, arms, and legs, Linda either applied a bandage or smeared Neosporin on the smaller cuts. On the large gash, I used butterfly bandages to pull the skin together and minimize scarring. After the storm passed, I take Grace to a clinic for stitches. Lastly, I put a cold compress on her eye. I sat with Grace as the storm raged outside. She looked so frail lying on my bed, and I noticed she had lost weight. Despite everything that happened between us, I still loved her and wanted to hold her close. I eventually drifted off to sleep, but I woke up in the middle of the night when everything suddenly went quiet. I went out and found Zoe still in the control room, looking up at the ceiling. "What's happening, Dad?" she asked, fear in her voice. It sounded like a jet engine a minute ago. Now it's deadly still. I knew what it was right away. The eye of the hurricane is passing over us now. "Come on, let's see what's happened outside." I grabbed a large flashlight before tentatively opening the front door. It was deadly still, and the air was hot and sticky. Stepping down the front stairs, I could see stars above, but I knew we didn't have much time, and I wanted to see how the house and the tower had fared. What I found pleased me. Though a half-dozen trees had come down, none had caused any damage. Walking around the house, I saw nothing amiss. Then I checked the tower, and the meter at its base read the correct amperage. I ran my flashlight up and down the tower structure but saw no damage at all. But we had only come through half of the storm. I grabbed Zoe's hand and led her back to the house. I explained that when the back wall of the eye passed, the storm would rage again at full strength. Several minutes after we got back inside, the wind began to howl at full force again. I sent Zoe to bed and stayed in the studio for another hour, reassuring listeners that the eye had passed and the winds would now diminish. I finally signed off for the night, wishing our listeners good luck and telling them they'd be in our prayers. I returned to my bedroom, dropped a quilt and pillow on the floor next to the bed, wrapped myself in a blanket, and drifted off. It seemed like only minutes had passed when I heard Aaron moving about and smelled coffee brewing. I stood up and saw Grace still asleep, so I slipped out to get some caffeine. I needed it. I realized there was no wind blowing. The storm was gone. I headed out the front door and saw more trees down but no obvious damage. A quick walk around the house showed no damage, and the tower was still standing tall. The base meter still showed the proper amperage. After greeting Aaron and grabbing a cup of coffee, I headed back to the bedroom. I was pleasantly surprised to find Grace awake. She looked at me with trepidation. "I'm so sorry, Michael," she said immediately. "You were right about everything. Everything you said about Eric was right, except he was worse than you thought. Took me too long to realize he was a snake in the grass. I can't believe I even went on a date with him. That's when I saw he was just a creep. He only wanted to get into my pants and trash you. I didn't realize until later that he had been undermining me from day one. Even when I saw you were right about how he worked, my pride wouldn't let me admit it. But finally, I had to face it and send a memo to Mr. Vallon saying I was firing Eric. I was immediately called to his office. That's when I first realized what Eric had been up to. He blamed every mistake he made on me or someone else. He had been writing memos that he said he sent to me, but I never got them. Mr. Vallon was angry, blaming me for failing as an executive vice president. When I tried to explain, he said he had no respect for people who blamed others for their own failings. "It's unbelievable that Eric could fool Mr. Vallon," I said. "I always thought Henry was a good judge of character. That he couldn't see through Eric's lies surprises me." Anyway, Grace continued, "He told me he was making Eric the EVP and removing me immediately. He also said I couldn't go back to my old position because he no longer trusted me. He said I could stay on as a salesperson if I wanted." "What did you tell Henry?" I asked, smiling, knowing my wife's temper. "You would have been proud." Grace returned my smile. "I told him that if he believed Eric's lies, then he deserved him and he could stick the salesperson's job up his ass." "What did Henry say to that?" "He said he was sorry I felt that way, but I told him he wasn't really sorry, but he would be once he realized what a mess Eric was." Then I cleared out my office and went home. "I wanted to call you so badly, but I was afraid you'd hang up on me. When I saw Hurricane Karen coming, I had to be with you and the girls." We sat silently, looking at each other. Then Grace asked, "Do you think you could forgive me for my stupidity?" "Absolutely," I said immediately and leaned over to kiss her. Grace explained she was within a mile of the station when a tree fell across the road. She tried to stop but still hit the tree at about 30 miles per hour. For some reason, her airbag didn't deploy, and she hit her head on the steering wheel. Grace didn't remember how she got to the station after the accident, but she remembered the wind knocking her down multiple times. The last time was coming up the driveway. After trying and failing to get back up, she crawled the rest of the way to the front door. She didn't have enough strength to knock, which explained the slapping on the door. The aftermath of Hurricane Karen was traumatic for the west coast of Georgia. Fortunately, my 2 translators came through the storm unscathed. We worked with FEMA and other agencies to broadcast emergency information. We were one of many radio and television stations serving the Atlanta-Savannah area, but we were the only station in our area helping the local people. We informed people where to get emergency food, water, and medical attention. Then we announced when various stores, schools, and services reopened. We received several awards from local governments and one from the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. Aaron and Linda returned to Naples to find their house destroyed. Rather than rebuilding, they took the insurance payout and moved to Miller Springs to be near us. When Grace was back to full strength and we were a loving married couple again, I asked her what she planned to do next. "I was wondering if you could use an experienced salesperson for your station," she said with a smile. I chuckled and pulled Grace into a tight hug. Not only could I use the best salesperson in the world, but I've got an idea on how to pay Eric and Mr. Vallon back. Weston Media had 2 radio stations in the Atlanta-Savannah market, so Grace and I targeted their sponsors. It was mostly Grace's charm and persuasiveness, but over the next 6 months, we lured 30 of their sponsors away. One day, I walked into the station, and Grace launched herself into my arms. Her kiss tingled all the way down to my toes. "What are you so happy about?" I asked, stepping back. "2 things," she said, holding up a piece of paper. "The latest Arbitron ratings are out, and we've moved up to 8th place, ahead of both Vallon stations. And the second thing? I just got off the phone with Henry Vallon. He called to tell me he had fired Eric and was sorry for how he treated me. He wanted to know if I'd consider coming back to New York to take my old job." The smile drained from my face. "Oh, and what did you tell Henry?" I told him no. I have the best job in the world, and I get to work with the love of my life every day. It's been 10 years since Hurricane Karen, and life is pretty good. Grace and I have the usual disagreements any married couple does, but we always make up. The big difference now is that Grace is much more willing to admit when she's wrong. The only problem is sometimes she's too quick to admit an error when it was me who was at fault. Zoe got her degree in communications and came to work at the station. After 3 years, I made her the station manager. She's doing a terrific job, and soon we'll move our studios to an office in Atlanta. Zoe believes we need a presence in the city, and I agree. Aside from the sales staff that will work from the new location, we'll only do 2 live shows, the morning and evening drive time shows. Grace graduated from Georgia State and took a job in Dade City, a small town just north of Miller Springs. She's a special education teacher and loves it. She's also married to a fellow teacher, and they're expecting their first child in June. This past year, Henry Vallon died, and his son became the CEO of Weston Media. Richard was not like his father and had no interest in radio. He thought it was a dying industry. They said the same thing about newspapers, but about 27% of Americans still read them. About the same percentage listen to the radio, which is much cheaper to operate than a newspaper. Richard decided to sell all of Vallon's radio stations at once. This wasn't a smart business move. By putting so many stations on the market at the same time, he lowered their value nationwide for a few years. But his mistake was our opportunity. We bought WSTP, an FM station serving Savannah, for $1.1 million. It was a 6,000-watt station that covered all of Savannah and part of Atlanta. Because the station was south of Savannah, we didn't have the problem of having more than 50 of the market. Our annual gross revenues were over $7 million before acquiring WSTP. I heard about Eric from time to time. After he was fired from Weston Media, he first tried to get a job in New York, but when that didn't work, he went back to California. He couldn't get a job in broadcasting there either, but he did become a new car salesman at a BMW dealership. Eric was doing well until he slept with a married customer whose husband had dangerous friends. I haven't seen a picture of Eric since the accident where he fell face first through several windows, but I've heard his days of seducing married women are over. Life hasn't been perfect for us. I had an emergency appendectomy, and 6 months later, I had my gallbladder removed. Grace broke her wrist and knocked out 2 teeth when she tripped over a parking curb. Thankfully, Zoe and Grace are both healthy, as are their husbands and kids. They each have 2 children. Zoe has a boy and a girl, while Grace has 2 boys. Aaron and I have taken up golf, and we're terrible, but we have a great time with the 2 other guys, Scott and Dan, who make up our foursome. The person with the worst score for the day has to pay for the first round. That's usually me. It's funny how life works. One of the worst days of my life turned out to be the best. Being fired by my wife pushed me to finally pursue my dream and succeed. It also created a much stronger marriage and family. My father first told me this saying, but I've heard it many times since then. What we regret most in life is not what we try and fail at, it's the things we never try at all. Thanks for watching this story. What would you do if you found yourself in Michael's shoes? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more intense stories. See you in the next video.